Boyd Malvo, Joseph Michael Geratano, Kevin Rashid Johnson, Jorge Torres, Jesse Leroy, Matthew Jr. 5 names pulled from completely different cases, different timelines, different crimes, different paths into the justice system. At first, there's no clear connection between them, nothing that immediately suggests they belong in the same conversation. But they do, because at some point, each of them crossed a line that led to the same destination: Red Onion State Prison. One of the most restrictive supermax facilities in the United States, built to house individuals the system considers too dangerous for any standard prison environment. Inside Red Onion, control is absolute. Inmates spend up to 23 hours a day alone. Movement is limited. Communication is restricted. Every detail is designed to reduce risk. Not just physical violence, but influence, coordination, and unpredictability. And that's where this story becomes more complicated. Because when you look closely at these 5 cases, the idea of dangerous doesn't mean the same thing in each one. Boyd Malvo was a teenager involved in a series of calculated attacks that brought an entire region to a standstill. His case raises questions about control, influence, and how responsibility is measured at that age. Joseph Michael Geratano was convicted in a case built largely on confession, one that still carries unresolved doubts decades later. Kevin Rashid Johnson became known not for violence inside prison, but for his ability to organize and challenge the system from within. Jorge Torres was linked to multiple crimes across different states, one connected years later through forensic evidence that didn't exist at the time of the original investigations. And Jesse Leroy, Matthew Jr., represents a pattern that developed over time, unnoticed until multiple cases were finally tied together. So here's the question that runs through all of this. What does it really take to be labeled too dangerous? Before we break each case down, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what's the time where you are right now? Because as we go deeper, each of these stories will challenge how you think about crime, investigation, and the system built to contain it. Boyd Malvo, long before his name became tied to one of the most coordinated killing sprees in modern American history, Boyd Malvo was a teenager moving through instability that never made headlines. Born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1985, his early life was shaped by constant movement and absence. His mother worked multiple jobs, often leaving him in the care of others, shifting environments, shifting expectations, and never staying long enough in one place to build a stable foundation. That kind of instability doesn't immediately create violence, but it creates vulnerability. And vulnerability in the wrong context can be shaped into something else. That turning point came when Malvo met John Allen Muhammad. Muhammad was older, controlled, and deliberate, a Gulf War veteran with a history of failed relationships and growing resentment toward the system he believed had failed him. When he met Malvo, he didn't present himself as a criminal. He presented himself as structure, discipline, purpose, and everything Malvo had been missing. What developed between them wasn't just mentorship, it was dependency. By the time they entered the United States together, that relationship had evolved into something far more complex. Muhammad wasn't just guiding Malvo, he was shaping how he saw the world. Through a mix of ideology, control, and isolation, Malvo's sense of identity became tied to Muhammad's direction. This is where behavioral psychology becomes critical. In cases involving younger offenders under the influence of dominant figures, investigators often look at coercive control. Not force in the traditional sense, but gradual psychological conditioning. Reinforcement, isolation from alternative perspectives, the creation of a belief system where actions that would normally be unthinkable begin to feel justified. And by early 2002, that conditioning had already begun to translate into action. The crimes didn't start with the DC sniper attacks. They started earlier, across multiple states. Smaller incidents at first. Murders that didn't immediately appear connected. Different locations, different victims. But when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, a pattern began to emerge. This is where investigative coordination becomes essential. At the time, law enforcement agencies across states were not always operating with fully integrated databases or real-time communication. Cases were often handled locally unless a clear connection was established. That meant early warning signs, Crimes that could have indicated a pattern remained isolated. Then came October 2002. The attacks in the Washington, D.C., a metropolitan area changed everything. Victims were shot in public spaces with no warning. A man walking across a parking lot, a woman pumping gas, a landscaper working in broad daylight. The randomness wasn't accidental. It was strategic. From an investigative standpoint, this created a major obstacle. Traditional profiling relies on patterns. Victim selection, geographic clustering, behavioral signatures. But in this case, those indicators were intentionally disrupted. The victims had no clear connection. The locations varied. The timing appeared unpredictable. What investigators were dealing with was controlled randomness. The weapon, a .223 caliber rifle, was fired from a concealed position, often from inside a vehicle. This allowed the shooter to remain hidden, reducing witness reliability and delaying response time. It also meant the crime scene itself offered limited, immediate leads. This type of attack shifts the entire investigative approach. Instead of focusing on victimology, investigators had to focus on ballistic evidence, geographic patterns, and communication. When notes began appearing at crime scenes, including demands for money, it introduced another layer. The offenders were not just committing violence, they were interacting with law enforcement. That interaction is often referred to as behavioral leakage. Even when offenders attempt to remain anonymous, communication can reveal patterns. Language, tone, timing, each detail becomes part of the profile. Eventually, a critical break came not from forensic evidence, but from public awareness. A vehicle description released through media coverage led to a tip from a civilian who recognized it at a rest stop. This highlights another key element in investigations: public engagement. In large-scale cases, the community often becomes an extension of law enforcement. When Malvo and Muhammad were arrested, the evidence inside the vehicle connected them directly to the attacks. The rifle, the modifications to the trunk, the maps, the planning. But even then, the case didn't simplify, because now the focus shifted to responsibility. Malvo was 17. Under U.S. law, that matters. Juvenile offenders are treated differently because of developmental factors. The brain, particularly areas responsible for impulse control and long-term decision-making, is not fully developed at that age. And this is where legal standards and psychology intersect. Prosecutors argued that the level of planning and execution demonstrated clear intent. Defense attorneys argued that Malvo was operating under the control of Muhammad, influenced to a degree that compromised his autonomy. The court ultimately treated him as an adult. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. But the case didn't end there. Years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles violated constitutional protections. This introduced a new legal framework, requiring courts to consider age, background, and potential for rehabilitation. Malvo's case became part of that broader legal shift. Inside prison, his behavior added another layer to the narrative. He pursued education, engaged in structured programs, and expressed remorse. These factors are often considered in reassessment hearings, but they don't erase the scale of the crimes. And that's where the tension remains. How does the system measure change? Not in theory, but in a case like this, where the crimes weren't isolated, where they altered public behavior across an entire region, where the psychological impact extended far beyond the victims themselves. This is not just about what happened. It's about how responsibility is defined when influence, age, and intent intersect. So here's something I want you to think about. If Malvo had been just a few years older, the legal outcome would have been unquestioned. If he had been younger, the system might have treated him differently from the start. But at 17, he sits exactly on that line. Do you think the system got it right in treating him as an adult? Or should cases like this always leave room for reconsideration over time? Let me know your perspective. Joseph Michael Geratano. Joseph Michael Geratano's case doesn't begin with clear evidence. It begins with a confession, and everything that follows forces one central question. When does a confession become unreliable, and what happens when the system builds an entire case around it anyway? Born in Virginia in 1957, Geratano grew up in an environment marked by instability and substance use. By his early 20s, he was living in Norfolk, moving between jobs, struggling with addiction, and spending time in a social circle where structure was limited and decision-making was often impaired. None of that made him unique. But it became important later when investigators tried to understand his mental state at the time of the crime. In February 1979, two people in the apartment where he was staying were found murdered. The details were violent and immediate. A woman and her teenage daughter, both killed in what investigators described as a brutal attack involving strangulation and stabbing. The crime scene itself suggested chaos, force, and proximity. Whoever committed it had been inside that apartment. Geratano was gone. Within days, he had traveled to Florida. And this is where the case takes its first critical turn. Instead of being located by police, Geratano approached a deputy himself and confessed. On the surface, that might appear decisive, a suspect voluntarily admitting involvement. But what followed complicated everything. He didn't give one consistent account. He gave multiple. Over the course of several statements, details shifted. In one version, he described actions that did not match the autopsy findings. In another, he misidentified the sequence of events. At times, he appeared unsure of what had happened, filling in gaps with assumptions rather than memory. This introduces one of the most debated issues in criminal investigations: false or unreliable confessions. Psychologically, a confession is not always a direct reflection of guilt. It can be influenced by intoxication, mental state, stress, or a desire to resolve internal confusion. In some cases, individuals convince themselves of involvement even when their memory is incomplete or distorted. In Geratano's situation, investigators noted that he had been drinking heavily and using drugs around the time of the incident. His emotional state during questioning was described as unstable. Despite that, his statements were treated as credible. Now compare that to the physical evidence. Fingerprints collected at the scene did not match him. Biological samples, including hair and other trace evidence, did not link him to the act itself. There were indications that more than one individual could have been involved, though that possibility was not fully pursued. This is where investigative prioritization becomes critical. When a confession is present, it can dominate the direction of the case. Other leads may receive less attention because the narrative appears complete. This is sometimes referred to as tunnel vision in investigations. Once a suspect is identified, evidence is interpreted in a way that supports that conclusion rather than challenges it. Geratano's trial reflected that dynamic. The proceedings were unusually brief. There was no jury. The case was decided by a judge in a bench trial that lasted only a few hours. The defense raised issues related to his mental state and the inconsistencies in his confessions, but those arguments were not deeply explored. The prosecution relied heavily on the fact that he had confessed and fled the state. Together, those elements were presented as proof of guilt. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. At that point, the case might have followed a standard path through appeals. But something changed. Inside prison, Geratano began studying law. Not casually, but with focus. He read case files, legal texts, and procedural rules. Over time, he started assisting other inmates with their appeals. This is where his case began to attract attention beyond the immediate facts of the crime. One of the individuals he helped was later exonerated through DNA evidence. That outcome raised a broader question. If Geratano could identify flaws in other cases, what about his own? Legal advocates began reviewing his conviction more closely. The inconsistencies in his confessions, the lack of physical evidence, and the speed of the trial became central concerns. Organizations focused on wrongful convictions and human rights took interest. The issue wasn't proving his innocence. It was the level of doubt surrounding his guilt. In capital cases, that distinction matters. The standard is not absolute certainty, but the threshold for irreversible punishment is expected to be high. When doubt exists, particularly in the form of conflicting evidence, it raises concerns about whether the outcome meets that standard. By the early 1990s, pressure had built around the case. Public attention increased. Legal scholars questioned the process. Advocacy groups argued that the risk of executing someone under those circumstances was too great. Just days before his scheduled execution, the governor commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. That decision did not overturn the conviction. It acknowledged uncertainty. Geratano remained incarcerated, eventually spending time at Red Onion State Prison. His classification there was not based on violent behavior inside the facility, but on his influence. He continued writing, organizing, and challenging prison conditions. His ability to communicate with other inmates and draw attention to systemic issues placed him in a category the system often treats with caution. After nearly 4 decades in prison, he was granted parole in 2017, but release did not resolve the case. He maintained his innocence until his death, and the questions surrounding his conviction never fully disappeared. This case highlights a critical legal concept: the difference between legal guilt and factual certainty. A conviction means the court has determined guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but that does not always eliminate all doubt, especially when the case relies heavily on a confession that conflicts with physical evidence. So here's something I want you to think about. If a case like this were tried today, with modern standards around interrogation, forensic analysis, and defense resources, do you think the outcome would be the same? Or would the inconsistencies carry more weight now than they did then? Let me know what you think. Kevin Rashid Johnson. Kevin Rashid Johnson's case forces a different kind of question, not just about what leads someone into prison, but what happens when their role inside prison begins to challenge the system itself. Born in Richmond, Virginia in 1971, Johnson came of age during a period that shaped many urban communities across the United States. The crack epidemic of the 1980s and early 90s created an environment where economic survival, legal markets, and law enforcement pressure collided. Opportunities were limited, and for many young men, the path into the street economy wasn't always a deliberate choice. It was often the most immediate option available. By his late teens, Johnson was already involved in that world. Drug distribution, territorial disputes, and the constant risk of violence formed the backdrop of his daily life. At 19, that environment led to a turning point. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with the shooting of another man tied to the same network. From the beginning, the case against him rested on a single critical element: informant testimony. A witness claimed to have seen Johnson commit the crime. That testimony became the foundation of the prosecution's argument. There was no direct forensic evidence placing him at the scene, no physical link tying him to the act itself. And this introduces a major issue within the legal system: the use of incentivized witnesses. Informants are often individuals facing their own charges. In exchange for cooperation, they may receive reduced sentences, drop charges, or other benefits. While this practice is legally permitted, it raises concerns about reliability. The incentive structure can create pressure to provide information that aligns with what prosecutors need rather than what is objectively true. Johnson has consistently argued that the testimony used against him was fabricated or influenced by those incentives. He has also pointed to broader issues, including racial bias and limited access to effective legal representation during his trial. Despite these claims, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. At that point, his story could have ended as another case within the system, but what happened next shifted the focus entirely. Inside prison, Johnson began to change, not in the way the system typically measures change, through compliance or silence, but through education. He started reading extensively: history, political theory, law. Over time, his perspective evolved into a structured critique of the system that had convicted him. This is where his case diverges from most. He didn't withdraw. He became more active. Johnson began writing essays detailing his experiences inside prison. He described conditions, treatment by staff, and the broader structure of incarceration. These writings didn't stay inside prison walls. They were circulated outside, published in independent outlets, and read by advocacy groups. When Red Onion State Prison opened in 1998, Johnson was among those transferred there. Red Onion was designed as Virginia's most restrictive facility, a supermax prison built around isolation. Inmates are held in single cells for up to 23 hours a day. Movement is tightly controlled. Interaction is minimal. From an institutional perspective, this environment is intended to manage individuals considered high risk. Those who have demonstrated violence, escape attempts, or behaviors that disrupt order. But Johnson's classification was different. It wasn't based on violent incidents inside prison, it was based on influence. This introduces a less visible aspect of prison management. Control is not only about physical behavior, it's also about communication. Johnson's writings, his ability to connect with other inmates, and his role in organizing protests placed him in a category that authorities viewed as a threat to institutional stability. He became involved in hunger strikes and coordinated actions across multiple facilities, challenging the use of long-term solitary confinement and other conditions. These actions required communication, planning, and the ability to reach beyond a single prison. From the administration's perspective, that kind of coordination carries risk. If inmates organize collectively, it can disrupt operations, strain resources, and create situations that are difficult to control. As a result, the response often involves isolation and transfer. Johnson was moved repeatedly, from Virginia to other states, including Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio. These transfers are part of interstate agreements that allow prisons to relocate inmates who are considered disruptive or influential. The goal is simple: break communication, limit connections, reset the environment. But even with these transfers, his influence continued. This raises a broader question about how the system defines danger. In most cases, the term is associated with violence, physical harm, immediate threat. But in controlled environments like supermax prisons, danger can also mean the ability to challenge authority, to expose conditions, or to organize others. Johnson's disciplinary record reflects this distinction. He has accumulated infractions, but they are largely tied to communication, possession of written materials, unauthorized correspondence, involvement in protests. There are no additional convictions for violent acts committed during his incarceration. At the same time, his writings have documented allegations of harsh conditions, extended isolation, limited medical care, and the psychological impact of long-term confinement. Some of these claims have been supported by external reports from human rights organizations. Others remain disputed by correctional authorities. This creates a layered narrative. On one side, a man convicted of a serious crime, classified as high risk, and repeatedly restricted due to his actions inside prison. On the other, an individual whose voice has brought attention to conditions that are otherwise difficult to observe from outside. So where does that leave the definition of dangerous? Is it based solely on the original crime? Or does it evolve based on behavior inside the system? Because in Johnson's case, the justification for his continued classification is not tied to new acts of violence. It's tied to what he represents. Someone who can influence others, someone who can organize, someone who can challenge the structure itself. And in a system built on control, that kind of presence is often treated with the same level of caution as physical threat. So here's what I want you to think about. If an inmate exposes conditions inside prison and organizes others to challenge them, should that be treated as a security risk or as a form of accountability? Where do you draw that line? Let me know your perspective. Jorge Torres' case is not defined by a single moment. It is defined by a gap between crime and identification, between evidence and connection, between what was known and what could actually be proven at the time. Born in Zion, Illinois in 1988, Torres grew up in what outwardly appeared to be a typical suburban environment. There was nothing immediately visible that separated him from others around him, but early warning signs existed. As a teenager, he was accused in a serious incident involving sexual violence. The case did not move forward, largely due to lack of cooperation from the victim. Without charges, the system had no formal mechanism to track or escalate concern. This is where one of the earliest fractures appears. When serious allegations do not result in prosecution, they often disappear from active systems. They remain as isolated reports rather than actionable patterns. That doesn't confirm guilt, but it also doesn't create accountability. It leaves space. In May 2005, that space widened. Two young girls, 8 and 9 years old, were found murdered in a wooded park near Torres' home. The crime shocked the community and triggered an intense investigation. The brutality of the attack, combined with the age of the victims, placed enormous pressure on law enforcement to identify a suspect quickly. And this is where the investigation took a critical turn. Instead of building outward from evidence, the focus narrowed rapidly onto someone close to the victims. Under pressure, investigators secured a confession from that individual. The case appeared resolved, but it wasn't. This introduces one of the most significant risks in criminal investigations: confirmation bias. When investigators believe they have identified the right suspect, subsequent evidence can be interpreted in a way that supports that belief rather than challenges it. Alternative leads are deprioritized. Contradictions are minimized. In this case, biological evidence had been collected from the scene: DNA, blood, and other trace materials. But without a match in the system at the time, that evidence could not immediately identify the perpetrator. Instead of serving as the foundation of the case, it remained unresolved. The wrong person spent years in custody. This is where forensic science becomes central. DNA evidence is not dependent on memory, testimony, or perception. It provides a biological link between an individual and a crime scene, but its effectiveness depends on comparison. Without a matching profile in the database, it cannot identify a suspect, it can only exclude. Years later, that changed. After high school, Torres enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and was stationed in Virginia. On the surface, this appeared to be a structured path: discipline, routine, accountability. But beneath that structure, his behavior escalated. In February 2009, a woman was abducted while jogging in Arlington, Virginia. She was assaulted and left unconscious, but survived. She provided a description of her attacker. Days later, additional attempts were reported involving similar methods. The pattern was emerging, but it had not yet been connected to a known suspect. Then in July 2009, the case escalated further. A naval officer was found dead inside her barracks room on a military installation, and the location immediately shifted jurisdiction. Crimes committed on federal property involved different investigative procedures and resources. The case was now being examined at both the local and federal level. At this stage, investigators were dealing with multiple incidents that appeared related, but still lacked a confirmed suspect. That changed in 2010. After another attempted abduction, the victim managed to escape and provided enough detail to identify Torres. His arrest marked the turning point. Now, for the first time, investigators had a suspect whose biological profile could be tested against existing evidence. This is where CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, becomes critical. CODIS allows law enforcement agencies to compare DNA profiles across jurisdictions. When a new profile is entered, it is automatically checked against unsolved cases. This is how connections are made between crimes that may be separated by years or geography. When Torres's DNA was entered, it matched evidence from the earlier cases in Virginia. But it didn't stop there. The same profile matched the unsolved murders from Illinois in 2005. In that moment, the gap closed. What had once been separate investigations became a single pattern, a timeline that stretched across states, connecting crimes that had previously been treated as isolated events. And just as importantly, it cleared the individual who had been wrongfully accused. This is one of the most powerful aspects of forensic science. It doesn't just identify perpetrators, it can also correct errors. But that raises another question. Why did it take years? The answer lies in timing. DNA technology existed in 2005, but the effectiveness of databases depends on participation. A suspect's DNA must be collected and entered into the system. Without that, the evidence has nothing to match against. This delay allowed Torres to continue. From a legal standpoint, his prosecution involved multiple jurisdictions. In Virginia, he was convicted of abduction, rape, and related offenses, receiving multiple life sentences. In federal court, he was convicted of murder on a military installation and sentenced to death. In Illinois, he later pleaded guilty to the murders of the two girls, receiving additional sentences. Each case added another layer to his profile. When he was placed in Red Onion State Prison, the classification was clear. High risk not only because of the violence, but because of the pattern. The ability to operate across locations, to target opportunistically, and to avoid detection for years. Inside prison, there have been no widely reported violent incidents involving Torres. But that does not significantly alter his classification. In cases like this, The original pattern carries more weight than behavior inside a controlled environment. Years later, his federal death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Policy shifts around capital punishment changed the outcome, but not the assessment of risk. He remains incarcerated with no possibility of release. This case highlights the evolution of investigative tools. Before widespread DNA databases, cases relied heavily on witness testimony, confessions, and circumstantial evidence. After those systems were developed, the ability to connect cases improved dramatically. But it also reveals the cost of delay. An innocent person lost years of their life. Multiple victims were harmed before the pattern was identified. So here's what I want you to think about. If forensic technology had been more advanced or more widely integrated earlier, how many cases like this could have been solved sooner? And how many mistakes could have been avoided? Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr.'s case is not defined by a single crime, but by a sequence that unfolded over years, across different locations, involving separate victims, separate investigations, and missed opportunities that only became visible in hindsight. Born in Virginia in 1982, Matthew's early life did not immediately signal the path that would follow. He was physically strong, athletically gifted, and earned opportunities through sports. In high school, he built a reputation as a football player, eventually receiving a scholarship to Liberty University. On paper, his trajectory appeared stable, structured, predictable, but that image began to fracture during his college years. At Liberty University, an allegation of sexual assault was made against him involving another student. The case did not proceed to formal charges. Instead, Matthew withdrew from the school. Within a year, a similar accusation surfaced at another institution he attended. Again, he left before the situation moved forward legally. This is where the pattern begins, but it doesn't yet look like one. From an institutional standpoint, these incidents were handled separately. Different campuses, different reporting systems. No centralized mechanism to track repeated allegations across locations. Each case on its own lacked the threshold to trigger prosecution, but together they suggested a behavioral pattern that remained unaddressed. This introduces an important concept in victimology. Victimology examines the characteristics of victims and the circumstances that make them vulnerable. In cases involving repeated allegations of similar behavior, patterns can sometimes be identified not through a single event, but through accumulation. The problem is, without coordination between institutions, that accumulation often goes unnoticed. After leaving college, Matthew returned to Charlottesville. He worked a series of jobs, including as a taxi driver and later in a hospital setting. These roles placed him in routine contact with the public, allowing him to blend into the community. There was nothing outwardly alarming about his daily life, no visible escalation that would draw immediate attention from law enforcement. Then in September 2005, a violent assault occurred in Fairfax, Virginia. A woman walking alone at night was attacked from behind. She was dragged into a wooded area, assaulted, and nearly strangled. She survived. That detail matters because it provided investigators with a first-hand account. She described her attacker in detail: physical build, hair, behavior. The description was strong enough to guide an investigation, but not enough to identify a specific individual. The case stalled. This is where investigative limitations become clear. Without a suspect to compare against, and physical descriptions and victim accounts can only go so far. DNA evidence may be collected, but without a match in existing databases, it cannot identify an unknown offender. It becomes evidence waiting for a future connection. Years passed. In October 2009, another case emerged in Charlottesville. A university student attended a concert and became separated from her friends. She stepped outside the venue and was unable to re-enter. Without her phone or belongings, she was left alone, trying to find her way back. She was last seen attempting to get a ride. Her disappearance triggered a search, but without immediate leads, the investigation slowed. Months later, her remains were discovered in a rural area. The cause of death indicated violence. The case gained attention, but again, no suspect was identified at the time. Now there were two serious cases, different locations, different victims, no confirmed connection. This is where geographic profiling becomes relevant. Geographic profiling examines the locations of crimes to identify patterns in offender behavior. It considers factors like travel distance, familiarity with the area, and risk tolerance. In cases where multiple incidents occur within overlapping regions, it can suggest that the offender is operating within a comfort zone. But without linking evidence, these cases remain separate. Then came September 2014. Another university student disappeared in Charlottesville after a night out. Surveillance footage captured her movements through the downtown area. She appeared disoriented, possibly under the influence, or separated from her friends. At one point, she was seen interacting with a man. Witnesses later described the interaction as uncomfortable. She appeared hesitant. At one point, she refused to get into a vehicle with him. That detail would later become critical, because this time there was footage. From an investigative standpoint, surveillance changes everything. It provides a timeline, a sequence of events that can be reviewed, analyzed, and shared. When law enforcement released the footage to the public, it triggered a wave of responses. People recognized the individual in the video. That individual was Jesse Matthew. This is where the investigation accelerated. Authorities searched his residence and vehicle, collecting physical evidence. At the same time, DNA samples were compared against existing databases. This is where the cases connected. The DNA matched evidence from the 2005 Fairfax assault. It also linked to the 2009 murder. What had once been separate investigations were now part of a single pattern spanning nearly a decade. This is the power of forensic databases. When evidence is preserved and entered into systems like CODIS, it allows future comparisons. Even if a case goes cold, it remains active in a different way. Waiting for a match. Matthew attempted to flee. He left Virginia and was eventually located in Texas. His capture marked the point where multiple jurisdictions came together. Each case previously handled independently was now part of a coordinated prosecution. He faced charges in different counties reflecting the locations of the crimes. The legal process resulted in multiple life sentences without the possibility of release. But the outcome doesn't erase the timeline. Nearly 10 years passed between the first known assault and his arrest. During that time, multiple incidents occurred that might have been prevented if earlier connections had been made. This raises a critical question about institutional responsibility. When allegations occur but do not lead to charges, what happens next? Are those incidents tracked in a way that allows patterns to be identified later? Or do they remain isolated, only gaining significance when it's too late? Matthew's case shows how patterns can exist without recognition, not because the information wasn't there, but because it wasn't connected. So here's what I want you to think about. And if those early college allegations had been handled differently, documented more thoroughly, or shared across institutions, do you think this pattern could have been identified sooner? And if so, how many later incidents might have been prevented? Let me know your thoughts. Boyd Malvo, Joseph Michael Geratano, Kevin Rashid Johnson, Jorge Torres, Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr., 5 different cases, 5 different paths. But they all converge in one place, Red Onion State Prison. To understand why, you have to understand what Red Onion actually is. Not just a prison, but a system within the system. A facility designed with a very specific purpose. Control at the highest level. Opened in 1998 in Wise County, Virginia, Red Onion was built as a supermax facility. That classification matters. Supermax prisons are not designed for general incarceration. They are designed for individuals who, for one reason or another, cannot be managed safely in traditional prison environments. The definition of cannot be managed is where things become complex. Inside Red Onion, the structure is built around isolation. Inmates are housed in single cells, typically measuring around 8 by 10 feet. Concrete walls, a solid metal door, a narrow window if any. Movement is controlled electronically. Doors open and close remotely. Interaction with staff is limited and monitored. Most inmates spend up to 23 hours a day inside that cell. The remaining hour, if granted, is usually spent alone in a small enclosed space, sometimes referred to as a recreation cage. Even that time is controlled. No group interaction, no direct contact. This is not incidental. It is intentional design. From a security perspective, isolation reduces opportunity. No contact means no coordination. No coordination means reduced risk of organized violence, escape attempts, or disruption. But that design also introduces psychological consequences. Long-term isolation has been studied extensively. Research in behavioral psychology shows that extended periods without meaningful human interaction can lead to cognitive decline, anxiety, depression, and in some cases, hallucinations. The human brain is not built for prolonged sensory deprivation. This creates a tension within the system. On one hand, isolation is used to maintain control. On the other, it can produce effects that make individuals more difficult to manage over time. Now consider the 5 individuals in this case. Boyd Malvo was placed in this environment not because of behavior inside prison, but because of the scale and coordination of his crimes. And the ability to operate in a way that avoided detection for weeks raised concerns about what he might be capable of in less restrictive conditions. Joseph Michael Geratano's placement reflects something different. Not violence inside prison, but influence. His ability to write, organize, and challenge prison conditions positioned him as someone who could affect the broader inmate population. Kevin Rashid Johnson represents that dynamic even more directly. His classification as dangerous is tied almost entirely to communication and organization. His presence in Red Onion reflects how the system manages individuals who challenge its structure, not through force, but through coordination. Jorge Torres was placed there based on pattern and severity. Multiple violent offenses across jurisdictions, a history of predatory behavior, and the ability to avoid detection for years. In his case, the classification aligns with traditional definitions of high-risk offenders. And Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. represents another form of risk, a long-term pattern of targeted violence that remained undetected until multiple cases were linked. His placement reflects concerns about repetition and escalation. So what you're seeing here is not one definition of dangerous, but several. This is where classification systems come into play. Inmates are assessed based on multiple factors: nature of the crime, behavior inside prison, history of escape attempts, gang affiliation, psychological evaluations. Each factor contributes to a risk score that determines placement. But those systems are not static. Either an inmate can be moved into or out of supermax conditions based on behavior over time. Compliance, participation in programs, and absence of disciplinary issues can lead to reassessment. However, in cases involving extreme violence or high-profile crimes, those transitions are less common. This brings in another layer: institutional caution. When an individual's history suggests a high level of risk, even in the absence of recent incidents, the system often defaults to restriction. The cost of underestimating risk is considered too high. But that raises a broader question. Is the purpose of Red Onion purely containment, or is it also punishment? Officially, the focus is security, preventing harm, maintaining order, protecting both staff and inmates. But the conditions themselves, extended isolation, limited interaction, and constant surveillance are often viewed as punitive. Human rights organizations have raised concerns about this. Reports have documented the psychological impact of long-term solitary confinement, arguing that it can amount to inhumane treatment when applied for extended periods. Legal challenges have been filed, questioning whether such conditions violate constitutional protections. At the same time, correctional authorities argue that facilities like Red Onion are necessary. From their perspective, certain individuals present risks that cannot be managed in less restrictive environments. Organized violence, coordinated disturbances, or targeted attacks within prison settings can have serious consequences. Supermax facilities are designed to prevent those scenarios, so the debate continues: security versus humanity, wound control versus rehabilitation, containment versus long-term impact. And this is where all 5 cases intersect, not because they are the same, but because they force the system to apply one solution to very different problems. A teenage offender influenced by a dominant figure, a man whose conviction still raises questions, an inmate who challenges the system from within, a serial offender identified through forensic advancement, a pattern of violence that developed over years, all placed under the same level of restriction. So here's what I want you to think about. If the definition of dangerous varies this much, Should the response be the same for all of them? Or should there be different approaches based on the type of risk they represent? Because Red Onion doesn't differentiate in its conditions. It standardizes control. Let me know where you stand on that. Boyd Malvo, Joseph Michael Geratano, Kevin Rashid Johnson, Jorge Torres, Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. At this point, you've seen each case on its own. The background, the investigation, the outcomes. But when you step back and look at them together, a different picture starts to form. Not about the individuals alone, but about the system that investigated, prosecuted, and ultimately contained them. Because these cases don't just tell 5 separate stories. They reveal 5 different pressure points inside the justice system. Start with investigation. In the case of Jorge Torres and Jesse Matthew, the issue wasn't the absence of evidence. It was timing and connection. DNA existed, witnesses existed, reports existed. But the ability to link those elements across jurisdictions took years. During that time, both men continued operating. This highlights a key limitation in earlier investigative frameworks. Information was often siloed. Local departments handled local cases. Databases were not always integrated. Communication depended on clear connections that didn't always exist in the early stages. Today, systems like CODIS have improved that process. DNA profiles can be compared nationally. Matches can connect cases across states almost instantly. But even now, the effectiveness depends on timely entry and proper collection. So the question becomes, how many cases remain unconnected simply because the data hasn't aligned yet? Now shift to confession. Joseph Michael Geratano's case exposes the risks of relying too heavily on statements that may not be reliable. His confessions were inconsistent, conflicting with physical evidence, and given under conditions that raise concerns about his mental state. False confessions are not rare. Studies have shown that individuals under stress, intoxication, or psychological pressure can admit to acts they did not commit, or reconstruct events inaccurately. Once a confession is obtained, it can shape the entire direction of the case. This is where procedural safeguards matter. Recording interrogations, verifying statements against evidence, and ensuring access to competent legal defense are all designed to reduce that risk. But Geratano's case shows what happens when those safeguards are limited or not fully applied. Now consider informant testimony. Kevin Rashid Johnson's conviction relied heavily on a witness who had incentives to cooperate. This is a long-standing practice within the justice system. Informants can provide valuable information, particularly in cases where direct evidence is limited. But the reliability of that information is always a concern. When a witness stands to benefit from their testimony, it introduces bias. The incentive structure can influence what is said, how it is said, and whether it aligns with the prosecution's narrative. Courts allow this, but it places responsibility on the defense to challenge credibility and on the jury to evaluate it critically. Johnson's case raises the question of how much weight should be given to testimony that comes with built-in incentives. Now move to behavioral influence. Boyd Malvo's case sits at the intersection of psychology and law. A minor involved in coordinated, premeditated violence under the influence of an older figure. This brings in the concept of developmental responsibility. The legal system recognizes that juveniles are different. Their decision-making processes are not fully developed. They are more susceptible to influence. But where does that consideration end? In cases involving extreme violence, courts often prioritize the severity of the crime over the developmental context. Malvo's sentencing reflects that tension. Later legal rulings introduced the idea that juvenile offenders should have the opportunity for reconsideration. But applying that standard is complex, especially in cases where the impact of the crime was so widespread. So the question becomes, how should the system balance accountability with the potential for change? Finally, look at pattern recognition. Jesse Matthews' case demonstrates how patterns can exist without being identified. Multiple incidents, similar behaviors, different locations, each one treated as an isolated event until forensic evidence connected them. This is where interagency communication becomes critical. If information is not shared effectively, patterns remain hidden. And when patterns remain hidden, opportunities for intervention are lost. Now bring all of this together. 5 cases, 5 different issues: delayed forensic connection, unreliable confession, incentivized testimony, psychological influence, unrecognized patterns. Each one exposes a different vulnerability in the system, and yet the outcome for all 5 is the same: a placement in a supermax facility designed for maximum control. This raises a broader question about how the system defines risk. Is it based solely on the crime, or is it influenced by how the case unfolded? Because in some of these cases, the process itself played a significant role in the outcome. An investigation that took years to connect, a confession that raised doubts, a conviction built on testimony, a juvenile tried as an adult, patterns identified only after escalation. Each of these factors shaped not just the case, but the classification that followed. So here's where I want to bring you into this. When you look at all 5 cases together, which issue stands out the most to you? Is it the delay in connecting evidence, the reliance on confessions or informants, the handling of juvenile offenders, or the failure to recognize patterns early? There isn't a single correct answer here, because each case highlights a different weakness, and understanding those weaknesses is what allows the system to improve. But improvement only happens when those questions are asked. Boyd Malvo, Joseph Michael Geratano, Kevin Rashid Johnson, Jorge Torres, Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. 5 names, 5 different paths. And by now, it should be clear that what connects them isn't simplicity, it's complexity. Each case challenges a different part of the system. Boyd Malvo forces a confrontation with age and influence, a teenager capable of participating in acts that required planning, coordination, and sustained execution. His case doesn't just ask what he did, but how responsibility should be measured when control and development intersect. Joseph Michael Geratano leaves behind something unresolved, a conviction built on confessions that never fully aligned with the evidence, a case where legal guilt was established, but factual certainty remains debated. His story continues to raise questions about how the system handles doubt, especially when the consequences are permanent. Kevin Rashid Johnson shifts the definition of danger entirely, not through violence inside prison, but through communication, organization, and resistance. His presence challenges the idea that control is only about physical behavior. It introduces the reality that influence, especially in a closed system, can be treated as a threat in its own right. Jorge Torres represents the evolution of investigation, a case that could not be fully solved when it happened, but was later connected through forensic advancements. His story highlights both the power of DNA technology and the consequences of delay. It shows how justice can arrive late, correcting errors but not undoing the harm that occurred in the meantime. And Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. demonstrates how patterns can exist without recognition. Separate incidents, handled independently, only forming a complete picture after years of escalation. His case reveals how critical it is for information to be connected, not just collected. So when you bring all of these together, the question shifts. It's no longer just about who these individuals are. It's about what their cases reveal, because each one exposes a different tension inside the system. Speed versus accuracy, confession versus evidence, testimony versus reliability, control versus influence, isolation versus impact. And Red Onion State Prison sits at the center of all of it, a place where those tensions are contained, not resolved. From the outside, it represents finality, a secure environment where individuals are placed once the system has reached its conclusion. But inside, those questions don't disappear. They remain in how inmates are classified, in how they are treated, in how risk is defined and managed over time. Because even after sentencing, the system continues to make decisions. Who stays in isolation, who gets reassessed, who is considered capable of change, and who is not. That process is ongoing, and it is shaped by everything you've seen in these cases. Now, I want to bring this back to you, not as a general question, but as a choice. Out of these 5 cases, which one changed your perspective the most? Not just in terms of the crime, but in how you see the system. Was it the role of influence in Malvo's case? The uncertainty in Geratano's conviction? The definition of danger in Johnson's situation? The forensic breakthrough in Torres's case? Or the missed pattern in Matthew's timeline? Take a moment and think about it, because the answer says something about how you interpret justice. And before we close, I want to hear from you again. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now on your side? Drop it in the comments. These cases travel far, and it always matters to know who's here following them. If you've made it all the way through, stay with me for one final thought. The system is designed to respond after something happens. Investigation follows crime. Prosecution follows investigation. Incarceration follows conviction. But the real question is not just how the system responds, it's how it recognizes what's coming next. Because in several of these cases, the warning signs existed. They just weren't connected in time. And that's where the difference is made, not in what is already known, but in what is understood early enough to act. That's where prevention lives, and that's where the system is still evolving.